Drink beer, it's good for you. I'm empty-handed and I'm feeling blue, and I'm gonna drink till the day that I die.
Hello and welcome to the video. In this video I shall be brewing an India Pale Lager. Yes, you heard that right, lager, not ale. Helping me do this is the mighty glycol chiller, which is as yet unreleased from Grainfather. I've been lucky enough to be sent a demonstration unit, so I'll be using this in various different tests, this brew included, and getting back to you about how I feel about it. Now obviously to give this a thorough testing this is going to take a while, but I will have all of the details available for you before its release. So you might be thinking already, what on earth is an Indian Pale Lager? I've never heard of this. Some of you will have, and I guess some of you won't, so I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction now. There's been a big push for hoppy beers in the craft brew and the general brewing market for quite some years now. And it's fair to say that quite a few different breweries have adopted this Indian Pale Lager style. The problem is, you've got a variety of different definitions and quite a few people arguing over actually what an IPL actually is. Some see this as an opportunity to make a hybrid beer, combining the hoppiness of a regular pale ale with a Pilsner, whereas others use the lighter taste notes of a Pilsner yeast to literally smash through with extra hop flavours than a regular IPA. Now personally I don't see a problem with either of these approaches, or anything else that any other brewery is deciding to do, as long as it makes good beer. As someone who isn't much into lager though, I've actually aimed this IPL more in the hophead direction than anything else, because I would just prefer to drink this myself. So for those of you that agree with this philosophy when it comes to this style, I think you'll very much enjoy this recipe. So here is my recipe, and one thing to note about this style is that because the lager yeast is very light, it allows a lot more flavour to come through. So with this in mind we actually have 4 different malts in this recipe, and hop pairings that just work so well together, especially in this style. As with all of my brew videos, I've included this recipe in the YouTube video description, and you'll also find it on the brew.grainfather website, where you can find an awful lot of my other recipes and recipes from others besides. Okay, so now let's start the brew, and as always we start this with the mash in. I would highly recommend that you focus very heavily on your grain crush. You certainly don't want anything too different to what I'm showing you here, which is not super fine and not super coarse. It's actually somewhere comfortably in the middle. The importance of this is that you can replicate successful brews time and time again, whereas if your efficiency is varying every brew, you're never going to be able to do this, so it's important to stabilize it. As you can see here, I am adding the grain very gradually and stirring it in as I go. This is a very important point and something that I would recommend to everybody. Moving forward now, I've actually added the last parts of grain now to our mash mix. The last mixing is obviously the last chance that we have before we start our mash to get everything correct. The objectives here are as follows. Firstly, we need to make sure that no grain is bound together with other pieces of grain. This is what is commonly known as dough balls. So by breaking up the mix of grain in your mash, this is one of the things that we're looking to achieve. In doing this, we then ensure that every single piece of grain is wet. Thus we can then make sure that we maximize the extraction of the sugars from the grain during the mash, and this of course is the final objective. All too often in other YouTube videos I have seen people rushing this process, and it certainly is really suggested against. You need to make sure that you're maximizing the efficiency from your grain each time. This way you're maximizing the equipment you've spent your hard-earned cash on, and also you then have repeatability, and that really is the name of the game here. So this mash is almost ready now, and I hope you see the difference here. These are important points. So here we go. This is now ready for the next step, which is of course the mash itself. We can now add our mash plate, and when you do this I would highly recommend that you push it down to the grain and then give it a small lift. This will increase your efficiency also. I also highly recommend the use of a sink strainer that you'll see me adding shortly. And what this does is this acts as a filter for any loose pieces of grain that quite frankly are inevitable in any reasonable grind of your grain. When calculating your water volumes, there's really nothing better to use than the official Grainfather smartphone and tablet apps. Do keep in mind though that there are a lot of variables used in making these calculations. As you can see here in this particular mash, the water level has come up a little bit higher than usual. Do not be concerned about this, just make sure that you have the mash plate positioned correctly and all will be fine. If you consistently find that your situation gives you say 1 litre less or more every time in the brew, then I would recommend that you subtract this amount from your strike and sparge volumes combined, of course, to compensate for this. Now, because I want this one to be more IPA-like, I'm doing a very typical cookie cutter mash schedule that you can see here. But if you're someone who does particularly enjoy lagers, then what you might want to do is actually do a lager schedule. And something quite typical for this would be 62 degrees C for 30 minutes and 68 degrees C for a further 30 minutes. This is of course your mash in. Mash out would be the same as always, and certainly it's also very nice to experiment with different ways for these beers and see what you like yourself. All of the video footage that I have of the mash for this one was actually at the very start, so here's a quick photo of what I had towards the end, and I think you'll agree not only is it having very nice clarity, it's a very nice colour also. You can also see in this photo some small pieces of grain that are being held by my sink strainer that acts as a filter, so that's nice. So it's now time to start the sparge, and I can't really emphasize this enough. Do this slowly and do it evenly. This is very important because we really want to make sure that we wash all of those sugars that are left behind out of our grain into our wort. So moving on to the boil now, and what I've been doing is actually monitoring the top of the beer that you can see here for activity. And once it starts moving just a little bit too much for my liking, as we approach the boil, I start giving it a good stir. And everything that you see here on this creamy head of the beer, it's just protein. Naturally it's important to give it a stir up because we don't want it to boil over. But after that point, you do have a choice. And this choice is really based upon what you actually prefer yourself. The first method is that you give it a good stir in so that in the end it drops. In my experimentation and experience, this does lend to a better tasting beer. But there is another option, and it should be mentioned that you should experiment with this yourself to decide what you prefer. What some brewers prefer is actually to spoon this out of the brewing kettle and remove it in that way, and they feel that they prefer the flavour of the beer using that method. So once again, do the experiment, see what you prefer and go with that. As you can see from this grain, I'm getting quite a lot of protein, and it's taking a while to actually get it all to sink down. But what I'll actually do is remove the majority of it before I add my bittering hop and start the timer for the boil. So a quick time warp later, it's now time to add my bittering hop. And there it is, all in now. So the process now is to give this a good stir in. Again, the objective here is to make sure that all of those hop particles drop down. You will find that during the boil, extra protein will start to accumulate on top. And again, my method for getting rid of this is just to stir it all in. The other thing that's very, very important during the boil, no matter which method you employ, is to make sure that you give the bottom plate a quick scrape with your spoon, just to make sure that no deposits are accumulating on there, which would then cause a false alarm and cause the system to drip. The amount of protein that you have during your boil is actually very significant in terms of the amount of times that you should scrape the bottom. So when you see lots of foam that's amalgamating all the time, that's your message to actually scrape the bottom more often. At 10 or 15 minutes to the end of the boil, what I do is I pause the timer and I set my Grainfather up in this fashion so that I can run boiling hot water through the counterflow chiller to sterilize it ahead. This is because at 0 minutes I always do a whirlpool. Doesn't matter what the style is, doesn't matter if there are whirlpool hops, I always whirlpool at the end. And I would encourage you to do the same, because it's just good practice to do this, not just from a beer perspective, but from a pump perspective too. I have this process in motion for between 3 to 5 minutes, and then after that I let the system get back up to boiling temperatures before I resume the timer. During the boil, I also like to get my fermenter ready by having it sparkling clean and then sanitize it using Star San. Here you can see a photograph of me putting the Star San back into my container, because this stuff is multi-use and I love it from that perspective. At this time, it's also important to sanitize any connecting tubes like this one that I'll use for yeast dumping and harvesting at the same time. So I've just hit 0 minutes in my boil time here, and it's time to start the whirlpool. I would certainly recommend that while you're doing this you wear protective gloves. Boiling hot water really isn't nice for your hands. I would recommend whirlpooling for at least 5 minutes and then doing at least a 5-minute rest before you actually transfer your water into the counterflow chiller and start cooling it down. The whirlpool will have already reduced some of your temperature already, so you get a nice head start there too. During the chilling phase, there's an awful lot of water that will go through your system, and I believe that it's wise to actually save a portion of this so that you can use it during the cleaning. The method that I would recommend when chilling is to actually transfer about half of your water and then start pitching your yeast. With a setup such as mine, there's no need to stop the pump while you do this, just pitch it directly in and then you can transfer the rest of your water on top of this yeast. The star of the show that I'm using here today is the Mangrove Jack's M76 Bavarian Lager yeast. Due to the relatively low fermentation temperature of this yeast, you will need to have some form of temperature control in place. For this reason I'm using the Grainfather glycol chiller in combination with the temperature controller on the conical fermenter. And you can see here I'm going through the lager profile just to show you the various temperatures that I'll be using during this fermentation. Now naturally the glycol chiller is not available yet on the retail market, so if you currently don't have the facilities, don't worry. There is actually some yeast that I can recommend to you that will get you fairly close to the flavours you'll get from a lager yeast, but they can be fermented at ambient temperatures, which is pretty handy. So here they are, and it's namely M54 Californian Lager or M10 Workhorse. These both work rather well. They aren't a direct replica of what you're going to get from lager yeast, but they're as close as you're going to get and certainly worth experimenting with. So there you have it. This marks the end of this video, and I hope that everyone has found it both interesting and useful. So if you did like this video, then please do go ahead and like it on YouTube. This really helps me out and allows the videos to be seen by a wider audience on YouTube. I've got a lot of videos in the pipeline for the future, so if you're interested in seeing what I've got coming up, then please subscribe for future content. If you have any questions on anything that I've covered in this video or in others, or anything to do with brewing in general, then please do not hesitate to get in touch. I'm more than happy to help. Until then, happy brewing!